Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. I just came from the Friday prayers, Salatul Jumu'ah, and on my way back, I was thinking about this onslaught. I would see it as an onslaught on traditionalism and traditional Islam, in the sense that people are finding that they need to rethink many of the laws, customs, social mores, that have existed amongst Muslim people for centuries. Things like capital punishment, things like inheritance laws, where in certain instances women would inherit half that of men. Things like polygamy and the cutting off of the hands of the thief and these types of things, which do exist in our religious texts, which also exist in the religious codes prior to Islam, meaning we do have examples of capital punishment and a polygamy even in Christianity. And so we find that as Muslims, as the world progresses and evolves, and the social and cultural context changes, we often ask ourselves, should we still have these things? Why capital punishment? Isn't capital punishment cruel? Isn't it barbaric? And we have many people questioning it, many people openly questioning it. I saw a video of Mufti Abu Layth, where he was saying that he's against capital punishment. I saw some writings of a scholar, I think it was Hamza Yusuf, who said that it's not necessarily that women have to inherit half the inheritance, half that of a man, not necessarily. And we should look at these things in a contextual way. And to some extent, I feel that I need to add another dimension to the discussion. And the dimension I want to add to the discussion is that we need to ask ourselves, to which extent is law, the Islamic legal system, or even the historic legal systems of other religions, to what extent are they encouraging a worldview or reformation of a society, and to what extent are they adapted to regulate a society in the current context? Okay, so to further elaborate, what I mean is that if you are a writer of law, for example, the way law generally comes about in empires and religions and religious empires and so on, is that the emperor or ruler or prophet or whoever has a worldview. They have a vision for their society and the way they believe their society would function, smoothly, peacefully, and where people could coexist without or with minimal conflict. And towards that end, they start to devise laws and bylaws and so on. And so when we look at the objective of the very idea of law, then it's largely to facilitate the peaceful coexistence of people in a society. And of course, sometimes laws are taken advantage of, or new laws are created that might privilege one group over another, and so on. Laws are sometimes written to privilege the rich, etc. So what I'm saying is that there is a function of law that is or helps to direct a society into a worldview. There's that function of law, which is kind of like a reformation. Then there's a function of law which tries to regulate a society within the context that it finds itself. So in that way, that's sort of the weaker bottom-up sort of approach to law as opposed to the top-down approach to law. So there's law from the basis of we institute laws from the perspective of power and governance. Then there's law in the sense that we have law in the interest of regulating a situation from the bottom up. That is, there's a context, there is a law, there is a governance, a governing power. There are norms and customs that are sort of in accordance with that legal and social context. And then we, as Muslim minorities in such countries, would then, of course, view law from a different angle or perspective. And so I want to sort of highlight this type of thing. There's law for reformation, law that wants to create a world view or bring about a social order, and then there's law that tries to solve the problems of people from the bottom up, not necessarily in the interest of having to govern. And so what I find with people like Mufti Abu Layth, for example, who I have great respect and admiration for, and I'm only bringing a dimension to this discussion. I don't think it's even important to discuss the issue of legality around these issues, because they would know that better than I would. But I'm 100% certain that we cannot deny the existence of capital punishment in Islam. But what I want to say is that a lot of I see of this modern sort of discourse coming from people who live in countries where Muslims are a minority and within a predominantly secular context, is that they tend to favor the idea that law must adapt to the predominant context within which they live, and things in the law which does not, must be reinterpreted. So this kind of hermeneutics, this textual gymnastics. And at the end of the day, a text is a text. It's open for interpretation. We often fabricate in the name of God. People of religion do it all the time. We make the text say what we wanted to say, and it's quite possible for us to do that. What I want to bring to your attention specifically, the listener, is that we need to understand, as much as we argue for context and the modern context, we need to also understand the context in which the old world existed and why punishments were harsh. That's what I want to sort of highlight. And kind of conclude with this, where I'm going with this, so you can, instead of wasting your time, you could just stop the video right now, if you don't like where I'm going with this. But what I'm basically saying is that religious texts, the Bible, the Quran, religious laws, the Mosaic law, the Islamic law, Christian law, or even other ancient laws, were visionary laws, meaning they had a goal, a worldview, a structure that they wanted to see society operate on or fall within. And it was a vision of, in case of Islam, it was a vision of peace. These laws are supposed to bring about a general social order of peace. And when a law comes about in a context of lawlessness, in a context of highway robbery, in a context of of people not being able to travel safe across the world, in a context of murders going unpunished, and gross violations where people lose their lives not infrequently, okay? And you now want to establish a norm, a new norm, where safe travel becomes a norm, where murder no longer happens frequently, where property is valued, etc., etc. The law needs to be harsh. And that's basically my point. I come from a country where there's very little law and order. I come from South Africa, one of the most dangerous countries in the world. And to some extent, we probably would welcome that some people at least get their hands chopped off for thief, because for stealing, because there's such a lot of it. Okay? Would that be necessary in a place where stealing is not widespread, where there is a general sense of law and order, and where criminals don't run free? Probably not. Probably not. Probably at some point it would no longer be necessary to chop people's hands off. The fact is that it has to remain within Islam that chopping the hand off of a thief is a legal precedent. And it has to remain there because societies are different. Contexts differ. Not in every society in the world would it be necessary, when order is maintained and when it's a general norm for people to live in order and not to steal, for the punishment of theft to be that harsh would not be necessary. And then you can come with your textual gymnastics and say that cutting of the hand doesn't mean necessarily literally cutting of the hand. And we could say that it sets forth or creates a maxim that crimes must be punished, but the punishment is not necessarily literally just that. But it also has to be literal, and that's basically what I'm saying. The literal application of law and Islamic law needs to remain intact, even if in certain contexts, cultural context, societal context, legal context, these laws may be suspended. And I think when you look at Islamic history, there are many examples of laws even within the Quran that were temporarily on hold or suspended, or based on the context and based on the leaders, the caliph or whoever, whatever we want to call these leaders, based on their judgments concerning their own context, they were very happy to suspend laws. So what I'm saying essentially is that there's a call, and I'm not saying that Mufti Abu Layth or Sheikh Hamza Yusuf or anyone is calling to change Islam. I don't think that's what they want to do, but there is a call of people who live in a context far removed from the original context, like many of us, in which these scriptures were revealed, and then we try to say that the scripture doesn't mean what it says, and I'm totally against that. It means what it says. Okay? Whether you want to apply it or not, or whether you see it as applicable or not, is a different story, but it means what it says. And I think we need to have that intellectual honesty. We should stop being apologetic for our scriptures and our text, our religious text, and this goes for any religious studies person, whether it comes to the Bible or Mosaic law or Islam. We should stop apologizing for the text. It means what it says, basically. Whether you feel that it should be practiced, whether it should be suspended, whether it fits within your context, that's a separate discussion. And why that's important is because the context changes over the centuries. The context has changed, and it will continue to change. And not everyone is living in your modern Western country where things appear to be in order currently. Some people are living in societies that are extremely dangerous, that where law and order does not reign supreme, and where even vigilantism, justice established by communities, are applied, and very harshly applied, because people are fed up of crime, people are fed up of the situation they're in. And do they sometimes institute the death penalty, sometimes even without the authority of a government? I've seen that in certain places, like in South Africa even, that happens in certain townships. Yes, they do. Can we blame them? Is it wrong for them to do that? That's a separate discussion, but within their community context, no, it's not. Within a government context, yes, it is, because we have to try to work through the means of the government, and we have to try to not disintegrate into anarchy. So there are just basically different dimensions in this discussion, and the same goes with issues like inheritance, issues like polygamy, and the death penalty. So basically, when it comes to something like the death penalty, in societies that are very tribalistic, and where qisas is a demand, al-aynu bil-ayn and so on, they will demand that justice be served, and in their version and their understanding of justice, if you killed my brother, I have the right to demand your life, and it's simple as that. And so in that case, the right is on the victim, and I don't need to be telling people that. Most people know that, and he can demand the life of the other person. And this is kind of the very basic form of Islamic justice. Why is that barbaric? And this is what I'm saying. I mean, and from what cultural context is that barbaric? That's from a cultural context that does not understand tribal societies and the tribal realities and family realities in a different kind of society. And what makes that society and that social norms necessarily better? That's what I'm saying. So we cannot, in our Islamic scholarship, adopt the arrogance of the British Empire and the arrogance of Anglo-Saxon kind of ethics and values, where we do not want to see where and how the context of other societies, or within the context of other societies that currently exist today, would necessarily need to apply Islamic laws in the way that it was applied historically, and not in a different way, or in a way that you might propose to do within your context. And that's basically what, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And so I am basically saying I 100% support the notion of capital punishment. I don't necessarily support capital punishment in every context. I don't necessarily say that everyone should apply it in that particular way, but I definitely support the notion of capital punishment. And I'm saying, as a Muslim, I cannot not support the notion of capitalism. The notion of capital punishment, because capital punishment exists within my religious text in the Quran, which I believe in, and it is there. It's a fact. It's not something I can run away from, and I support the notion of it 100%. I believe that there must absolutely be capital punishment within the context that is relative or relates to those laws. And similarly with polygamy, and with inheritance, and with everything else that people would like to object to regarding our laws. Is there a need for us to look at things in a different way? Absolutely. I mean, do scholars have the right to question all these laws and try to reinterpret them? Absolutely, they do have the right. But I'm saying, just acknowledge that the space and place from which you come from is not the only space and place. And the goals of law from the angle that you're approaching it is not the only goals for which law is used. And when we look at the angle of governance, law and order, and trying to establish a worldview through governance and law and order, from that perspective, then law is also a way of reformation and not just a way of adapting to context and culture. And so that is the sum total. I hope that I was clear. And again, I'm saying that we can never, ever, ever abrogate the laws that are literally mentioned in the Quran. There's no figurative, metaphorical explanation for ahkam in the Quran, and we can never argue it away. And I don't appreciate arguing it away because it's a foundational text. In Islam, I am perfectly happy with people questioning the authenticity of a hadith and debating it, the validity, the context, the law, its applicability, and all of that. But when it comes to things that are explicit, you walk a dangerous path. That's my honest opinion. The laws are there. They should be maintained literally as they are, and to which extent they are applicable contextually, that is for people who sit in judgment seats to decide. But simply to say that they are not applicable, that they should be reinterpreted, radically reinterpreted, to not mean what they actually literally mean, I'm sorry, I don't think that flies. I don't think that's a safe route to take, not as a Muslim, not as a believer in a textual tradition that does have a history of precedent. That's the main thing, if it was a textual tradition, we somehow found a book in a cave. The book said that this book is from God. It's called the Quran. We read it and we apply it just within our cultural and political and whatever context we find ourselves in. Fine, we're doing our best. I'm sure that Allah will reward us for that. But we don't have that situation. We have a situation where we have a book. We also have a history. We have precedents in law. We have established mores and traditions. These traditions, yes, sometimes culturally influenced and influenced by other empires and legal systems and all of that there. I'm not denying those things happened. But we still have a tradition to contend with. We didn't wake up one day, read the Quran, and decide to become Muslim. We inherited a legacy of Islam from people before us and from people before them. And we do have a precedent, and we do have a law. And simply trying to radically alter that law is not something we should be doing, in my opinion. We can argue, and the argument that I think is more intellectually honest is not to say the Quran doesn't mean that which it exactly literally says. That's not. A lot of people are doing that. The Quran says, for example, so hit the woman, and then we want to linguistically jump around, do all kinds of gymnastics to try to say the Quran is not saying that a man in a particular context and situation can hit his wife. We try to say, no, the Quran is not saying that. Okay? That's just absurd. That's exactly what it's saying. How we interpret it, how we apply it, how we view it, whether we think we can suspend it, and so on. That's the space for the debate, is what I'm saying. Because we got to remember, we're dealing with an ancient text. We're dealing with a text that was revealed in a certain context. The context radically differs from our context. And we're not going to make headway as Muslims if we are trying to alter the text itself by reinterpreting what it says and what it literally means. I think we accept what it literally means, okay? We have a separate discussion, on whether it is applicable and how it should apply. And we shouldn't be saying, no, it doesn't say that. Okay? And I can argue at length. And let me just mention something about the wife beating story, because this is another thing that people are constantly apologizing for, and constantly trying to either say the Quran doesn't mean that, or saying that, no, the Quran does mean that, but as a last resort. And so we be trying to apologize. Let me just say, forget about apologizing, okay? I didn't write the Quran. You didn't write the Quran. Okay, there's no need to apologize, okay? That's what it says. Now, why does it say that? That's what we should be asking ourselves, okay? What is the historical context in which, type of societies in which these people lived when the Quran said that, And that is more the question we should be asking, and how that relates to us now, okay? I mean, I personally don't hit my wives. I practice polygamy. I have more than one wife, but I don't hit them ever. Have never. Will never. But I do understand a context in which people, even today, hit their wives. I understand the context in which, in certain instances, where in fact hitting the wife, not abusing her, hitting her, is better than the alternative. And I will, in the next video, tell you which context that is, because I've experienced a gamut of societies, from very primitive, very violent, very dangerous, to very refined. And I'll tell you there is a real context to real societies in this day and age where the alternative to hitting the wife is far worse than not hitting the wife. Because there are times, literally in this world today, in societies, where physical restraint is needed. And sometimes that involves a slap. Okay, and that is something that was very easily understood, not even 30 or 40 years ago. It was something that was very easily understood today, because we have feminism and a wave of claims of domestic violence and abuse, which I don't deny exists, and which I don't deny is evil, right? Is very different from hitting. And I want to discuss that in the next video. And well, enjoy the rest of your day. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam.